Let me welcome those of you who are here with us in person at the Moot Court Room at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah for this final, for this semester, Green Bag presentation. We very much appreciate you joining us today, as is reflected, as we'll see, the presentation today is about a book recently published by the University of Utah Press entitled A Watershed Moment, The American West in the Age of Limits. We have with us four speakers. I'll introduce them in a bit. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Bob Kiter, formerly the director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and still a member of the faculty and engaged with the center. Let me begin with our native lands acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between the tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Let me also note, in addition to today's program, which again concludes our Green Bag series for this semester, we'll have online shortly the Green Bag noon hour programs for spring semester. So please check the Stegner Center website for that information. Let me also encourage you to join us on March 20th and 21st for the Wallace Stegner Center's 30th annual symposium on the subject of breathing easier, air pollution challenges and solutions. There is a registration required for attendance at the symposium, and registration will open in January. We're very pleased today to be joined by co-sponsors for today's program on the book, and that's the University of Utah Press, which published A Watershed Moment, The American West in the Age of Limits. I should also note that the University Press has books available for sale in the lobby, and today's speakers would be happy to sign copies of A Watershed Moment following the presentation. I'd also like to extend our deep appreciation to the Cultural Vision Fund, which provides support for the Stegner Center's various events, including our annual symposium, our Young Scholar Program, and our Green Bag series. We're very much in the Cultural Vision Fund's debt. Now, to today's program. We have four speakers. They'll each speak individually, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of their presentations. Let me introduce each of them now so I don't have to bounce back and forth. First up, we'll hear from Evelyn Brister, a professor of philosophy at Rochester Institute of Technology and a faculty affiliate in the Public Policy and Environmental Science program there. She will address optimism about facing limits. Next up, Seth Ahrens, a research scientist with the Western Water Assessment Series at the University of Colorado and the University of Utah. He will address a new Glen Canyon emerges as Lake Powell dries. Third up, Bonnie Baxter, professor of biology and director of Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster University here in Salt Lake. She will address Human-Driven Changes and Solutions at the Great Salt Lake. And then finally, we will hear from Robert Frodman, retired professor of philosophy and independent scholar living in Hoback, Wyoming, who will address science, art, and the future of the American West. These presentations are tied in with their contributions to the book. I should note that Robert and Evelyn are two of the three editors of A Watershed Moment. And it's a very timely book and publication. Having had the opportunity to review page proofs of it, I think it's appropriate that the Stegner Center is hosting this event and hoping that it will help to get the book out into the public eye. A final note, as for the question and answer session at the end, please take advantage of the Slido program. The information is on the screen behind me. If you'd like to ask a question, follow the instructions there. And if you like a question, you can click on that question and it will rise to the top. And we'll have the speakers each on stage here to respond to questions at the end. With that, let me ask Evelyn to join us to make the first presentation today from A Watershed Moment. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bob, and thank you also for writing the foreword to the book, which puts it in a really important context. So the talk today, my talk is labeled Optimism About Facing Limits because it addresses the subtitle of the book. The book is titled A Watershed Moment, The American West in the Age of Limits. So I want to say something about those limits. First, I want to talk about the origin of the book. So during the pandemic around summer of 2021, Bob and Luther and I were talking and having a lot of conversations about various issues. Both of them live in Jackson, Wyoming. And I'm a philosopher of science. So I come from a background where I've written about sustainability, I think about environmental values, climate change, and about the democratic processes of addressing these kinds of environmental issues. Bob is also a philosopher of technology primarily, but he's got a wide interest in lifestyle and cultural changes, and he was living through the kinds of changes that Jackson is facing. Luther was the founder of the Sonoran Institute, so he has a background in nonprofits addressing environmental issues, but he's currently Teton County Commissioner in Teton County, Wyoming. And so he works every day with people on the ground addressing problems having to do with development and housing and environmental issues, water quality. So we were having these discussions and we thought it would be really great to write a book. But there was so much that we wanted to do and we had to conceptualize how to get that done. First of all, there were a lot of problems and we saw that they were interconnected and we did not want to treat them in a way that removed those connections. We also saw that we were talking about issues in Jackson, Wyoming, but we saw that there were a lot of issues that were reappearing in different forms around the West. And finally, we didn't really want to be the only voices in this book. We thought that there are a lot of constituencies, the issues cross jurisdictions. We want to be able to capture personal stories of the people who are involved in facing social challenges in a way that maintained their stories and that address the differences as well as the similarities. So we wound up with a format of the book. It has 25 chapters that each chapter addresses a place and a problem. And so we had to balance the different places in the West with the different problems and create some chapters that showed some contrast, as well as some that treated the same issues but in different ways. So here are some examples. We have 2 chapters, one on Farmington, New Mexico, one on Salmon, Idaho. Both have to do with the energy transition and mining's boom and bust cycles, but different perspectives on how that's playing out. We have one chapter on Telluride, Colorado, and on Jackson Hole. Both of those are facing issues with affordable housing, but the chapters look at those in different ways. We also have a chapter on Bozeman, where the economic issues of development can be treated in a different way, because there's much more room to grow than there is in Telluride or in Jackson. We have 2 chapters, one on Bears Ears and one on Badger 2 Medicine area in Montana, that address co-management between tribes and federal lands. And then, of course, there are wildlife issues. Conflict, managing the interface between the natural environment and the built environment for wildlife. So there's a chapter on ungulate migrations in Wyoming, and there's a chapter that we'll hear more about today on beaver rewilding in Idaho and around those areas. And then a lot of chapters address water resources. So today, Seth Ahrens will tell us about his studies in Lake Powell, but there are other chapters. Also, Bonnie's is about the Great Salt Lake. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Bonnie's is about the Great Salt Lake. And there's a chapter about the Snake River and others. One chapter about Phoenix and troubles with water there. So the voices in the book include academic researchers, elected officials, citizen activists, practitioners, journalists, government scientists, and all of them in some way have been personally involved in some particular episode of decision making. So why the age of limits? That subtitle was something that we thought about for a long time. On the one hand, no one wants to think about limits, right? We don't want to be limited. We want to have everything. But so all of the issues that we're facing have to do with some limit or other. A limit in terms of where development can happen, where houses can be built, where roads can be built, limits on how much water there is, and on even things like there is a changing community character. And so what's limited there is the ability to continue to have the same sense of community as new people move into that area. So the West has been changing rapidly. Between 1960 and 2020, the US Census said that this area more than tripled in terms of its population size. And when we think that the West can grow and more people can come in and there are no limits, then we run up against water shortages and unequal inequity in terms of wealth, and all of this sets the stage for conflict. Something that's common throughout the book, though, although there's a lot of differences between chapters, not all the authors treat the recommended policies. Each chapter ends with a recommended policy, but not all of them have the same perspective. But what we see over and over is that, first of all, acknowledging that there are limits, but also acknowledging that there are many different ways to face those limits. We can think about some of the new research in ecology that shows, for instance, how much trees exchange nutrients underground through their root systems. And there are many other examples in biological systems at all levels, from the cellular level to the organismic level to the ecological level. Whereas we had a more, biologists had a Darwinian view of competition primarily as something that drove change in biology and that led to the kinds of biological systems that we see, competition over scarce resources. We're now learning in ecology that there's another perspective, and that much of the resilience in biological systems are due to cooperation, the creation of interdependencies, and sharing of resources. So I think the book asks us to adopt that kind of framework, and we're not wearing rose-colored glasses. We know that competition continues to exist and will exist in policy situations, but also that in addition to a competition framework that recommends policies like doing everything we can to shut the door to in-migration to the West, or that limits access to national parks. Those are necessary policy recommendations in some cases, but there's also a lens where we can think about cooperation frameworks, and that can maybe short circuit some conflicts and lead to more collaboration. Making this change from a competition framework to a collaboration or a coordination framework allows us to switch from prioritizing consumption values to prioritizing relationship values, and asks us to think about how we're in relationship to the land, how humans are in relationship to wildlife, and how our communities relate to each other. So each of the chapters in the book identifies some positive solutions to the policy problem that it takes up. And these include things like looking at longer timescales, not trading short-term benefits like thinking about how to achieve longer-term benefits rather than short-term benefits, thinking about justice, how do we create benefits for the least well-off among us, considering flexibility, adaptability, and how do we plan for resilience. I think that's especially important to me because as an environmental scientist, I think a lot about climate change and how that's affecting the West, how we can adapt as the climate changes around us. A lot of the chapters, we didn't anticipate this, but many of them focus on how we can collect data and share it in order to create opportunities that we didn't see before. And finally, creating local control so that benefits stay in communities. So if there's more information, we have a website for the book that lists other events and the press about the book, and we invite you to look at that. And now I want to hand it over to Seth, who will talk about Lake Powell.
Good afternoon. My name's Seth Arns, and thank you for setting up this talk, Evelyn. And I think this idea of limits is a really good place to start with what I'm going to talk about. One of those limits that we all face in the West is water. And when we think about water today and in the future, often there's this nexus of water use, drought, and climate change. And the outcomes from that nexus is almost always some version of bad or challenge, or there's losers. Well, I'm going to talk about one of perhaps the very few situations where there's a positive outcome from this nexus of water use, drought, and climate. And that's the fact that Glen Canyon has reemerged from the waters of Lake Powell, and something magnificent is happening on this landscape. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So first, I want to set the scene a little bit for the place we're talking about and just some basic history of it. So the place we all know and have come to see on our maps isn't Glen Canyon, it's Lake Powell. Lake Powell was formed, it's a man-made reservoir, even though it says lake in its name, it's a man-made reservoir, and it's formed by the Glen Canyon Dam, which was constructed in the late 50s and early 1960s. The dam was finished and Lake Powell began filling in 1963. It took 20 years for Lake Powell to completely fill. And by the time it did, it had inundated 186 miles of Glen Canyon and all of its 115 tributaries. Glen Canyon is really unique, even in the Colorado Plateau, both because of the great number of tributaries, but also that the majority of those tributaries, as much as 2/3 of them, have perennially flowing water. So there's springs that feed these creeks, and the water provides life to the desert. Also, upstream of what we kind of typically consider Lake Powell, 25 miles of Cataract Canyon was flooded, 25 miles of the Escalante River Canyon, and specifically, I'm going to point out Willow Gulch. This is just because I'm going to be showing you some pictures of how ecosystems are restoring on their own in Willow Gulch. And then also 50 miles of the San Juan River was flooded by Lake Powell. Now I want to point out, and this is an important point, that the last time the reservoir completely filled was in 1999. So that was 25 years ago. So what's happened over that 25-year period? Well, we've been in mega drought in the Southwest. Mega drought is a term that's thrown around a bunch, but really it just means drought that lasts more than 20 years. Sometimes we can start to think about aridification when bringing climate change into the mix, but let's just think of this as a really long drought that was exacerbated by climate change and warming temperatures. But what I'm interested in is how this has changed the landscape. So you see two images of Lake Powell. One, there's lots of water covered by Lake Powell in 2011. The image in 2022, 11 years later, the lake has dropped 130 feet, and you can see the reservoir covers much less land. These two bays are Bullfrog Bay, where Bullfrog Marina is, and Halls Bay. Bullfrog Bay has shrunk to a fraction of its original size, and Halls Bay is almost non-existent. So over this 25 years, from 1999 to April 2023, Lake Powell dropped 180 feet in elevation. This is a massive amount of water that the reservoir lost, the savings account that we've been using in the Western United States. But it also created this huge change in landscape from an underwater landscape under the waters of Lake Powell to a terrestrial landscape. And I want to stress that there's not one reason for this decline in water levels in Lake Powell. It's really the combination of how we use water in the Colorado Basin in the West, drought, and climate change. Now, what I'm going to focus on for this talk is, well, what's happening on the landscape that used to be submerged by Lake Powell and now is a terrestrial landscape. And I want to stress that that area of land is a really large area of land. In April 23, when the lake reached its low elevation of 3,519 feet, there was over 102,000 acres of land that used to be underwater in Lake Powell that had now emerged for varying periods of time, and ecological succession was occurring on these lands. So this is the natural process in which plants and then animals colonize an area of land that's been subject to disturbance. So this disturbance was the flooding by Lake Powell and then the covering of a lot of this landscape by sediments. So before I go on to sort of the really kind of happier story of how this landscape is restoring, I want to show you some images of what the landscape looks like that probably most people see from Lake Powell. This is probably what you'd see if you're out on Lake Powell in a motorboat or maybe go for a short walk up a tributary canyon. You see the customary bathtub ring showing how high Lake Powell used to be. You see a wall encrusted with dead quagga mussels. There's bare soil and sediment everywhere. This is a consequence of the reservoir. The Colorado River, the San Juan, the Escalante, the Dirty Devil, and all the 115 tributaries, they carry a massive amount of sediment downstream. When that sediment hits the lake, which varies in elevation, that sediment falls out and is deposited on the land surface. You see the photographer here huddling his head. That's because there's a dust storm of epic proportions blowing through this canyon. However, that is not the focus of this talk. That's just what one might see if they don't leave their boat very far in Lake Powell. If one digs a little bit deeper, find kind of a remarkable story unfolding. And I'm going to take you on a little photographic tour up Willow Canyon. This is in the Escalante drainage. Willow Canyon's a long, low gradient canyon that's fed by springs. So this is water that flows all year round. And this is really important for life to develop in the desert, for plants to establish, for ecosystems to form, and for animals to live there. In 1999, when Lake Powell was last full, it extended 5 miles up the canyon. When I visited this canyon last in May of 23, Lake Powell extended only 1 mile up the canyon. That meant that there was this 4 miles of riparian corridor where ecosystems have been allowed to reestablish naturally over the last 25 years. And I want to stress that it's a really interesting man-made and natural experiment that we have here. It's an experiment in ecological succession. So how plants and animals slowly colonized a bare landscape and how those ecosystems form and develop over time. And walking from Lake Powell up a tributary canyon like Willow Creek is like walking back in time. As you're walking up this canyon, the landscape is getting older and older. This doesn't happen in a nice smooth transition. It happens in these jumps because the landscape age is determined by when the last time that elevation was inundated by Lake Powell. Some of these landscapes low down in the canyon, this is right at the Willow Canyon Delta, have only been out of water for 2 years. But even after 2 years, you're seeing an ecosystem developing. Native wetland grasses, native willow and baccharis shrubs. As you move just a little further up the canyon to a landscape that's been out of water for just 3 to 4 years, you're starting to see what looks like a relatively normal and well-developed desert riparian ecosystem. This is composed mostly of native plant species, native grasses, wildflowers, coyote willow. The taller trees there are Gooding's willow. And then as time goes on, animals start to colonize as well. This is a little further upstream. It's also a forest of Gooding's willow, but you can see in that picture, there's kind of a nice flat line in the creek drainage. That's a beaver dam. Beavers had colonized Willow Canyon, and I see this in many canyons around Glen. A little further upstream to where this waterfall is, this is a spot where beneath the waterfall has been out of water for 6 years, above the waterfall out for 12 years. All the way in the back of that picture, that tall green tree, that's a cottonwood. It's about a 45-foot tall cottonwood that established within the last 12 years. This is a keystone species in this ecosystem. That tree's probably 10 or 12 inches in diameter. A little further up the canyon, this is actually kind of beneath that cottonwood tree. You're seeing more of this willow forest. This is a Gooding's willow forest. One thing I want to point out, one thing that we're not seeing along these creeks, tamarisk. That's been kind of a scourge of river and riparian habitats in the West. Tamarisk is not doing well in these landscapes. Finally, as you move up to some of the oldest landscapes, at least oldest in terms of how long ago they emerged from Lake Powell, this is a landscape that came out 24 years ago. And to the untrained eye, it's really difficult to tell that there was a lake here 24 years ago. You're starting to see a biologically diverse ecosystem, a biologically rich ecosystem, cottonwood trees 50 plus feet in height, and most of what you're looking at here are all native plants. The final thing I want to point out is Glen Canyon and other canyons like it in the Colorado Plateau have this very special and unique ecosystem, the hanging garden. These are systems that grow along cracks in the walls of the canyon where water seeps out in the long springs, and unique plant species like maidenhair fern and monkey flower and columbines grow here. Many of the plants that grow in these locations, while they're not native only to Glen Canyon, they're native only to canyons like this in the Colorado Plateau. And these two locations have only been out of water for 5 and 11 years. Also important to desert ecosystems is the cryptobiotic crust. This is that black moss-like covering that many of you have seen in the desert. This is extremely important for sort of the overall health of the ecosystem and especially in stabilizing all these loose sediments that have been deposited. Crusts are typically very slow to grow, but I am seeing these crusts start to develop after as little as 5 or 6 years. These two locations with pretty well developed cryptobiotic crust, they've been out of water for just over 20 years. And finally, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts on what the future of these restoring ecosystems in Glen Canyon may be. Ultimately, the future of these systems are going to be at the whim of two things: future water management, how water is managed in the Colorado Basin, and specifically Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and future climate. And both these may work in opposing directions at times. Also, after Lake Powell reached its low elevation in April 2023, we had a massive runoff year. The lake rose 65 feet. So many of the landscapes that had only been out for just 1 or 2 years have been re-inundated and flooded now. Now, thinking about future management, the first thing on the horizon is negotiations for what's called the post-2026 guidelines for the Colorado River Compact. These are guidelines that have been in place that largely have to do with how Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam and those two large reservoirs are managed. And this is going to be very important in determining the fate of these ecosystems. Overall, in this process, upstream impacts of Glen Canyon Dam are not well considered, and it's very likely that these restoring ecosystems will not be considered in the environmental impact statement for the post-2026 guidelines. This is a place where, as Evelyn was talking about cooperation, this is a place where cooperation really could have win-win situations. Future climate dictates that it's very unlikely that Lake Powell and Lake Mead will ever fill again, that both of those two reservoirs will be full at the same time. So given that, there are certainly possible policy outcomes that could conserve some of these restoring ecosystems while not wasting a drop of water. And with that, I'd be happy to pass this to Bonnie.
Very cool. I love hearing about Lake Powell and a place where the decline of water is actually a positive step. It's really great contrast to what I'm going to talk about. Is it okay? It's okay if I step here with a microphone, right? Okay. I move around too much, so if I am not mobile, I might move away from the mic, so this way I'm safe. So I study Great Salt Lake, and I have been studying it for about 27 years. And when I first heard from Bob and talked to Evelyn, they said, we really need a chapter on this issue in the book. And but they really wanted it from the viewpoint of solutions. And I'm very famous for saying we scientists like to point to the problems, but we don't really work on the solutions, you know. So I can tell you what's happening at the lake. But my involvement on many state committees and so forth means that I've been intimately involved in discussions of solutions. So I appreciate the opportunity to have that framework that I built my chapter around as well. So Great Salt Lake began about 13,000 years ago as the Ice Age melted and the Holocene came upon us. And that dark spot in the middle is, I think this is it? Nope. Yeah. Okay, the dark spot in the middle is Great Salt Lake. The light blue was the Pleistocene Lake Bonneville. So that's where the woolly mammoths were. The interesting thing about Great Salt Lake is it was born right at the time that humans were coming into Utah. So Great Salt Lake really has not existed without people, and I find that fascinating. So if you are looking at the paleontological and archaeological sites around Great Salt Lake, you will discover that there are some caves, and many of these were inhabited, some of them early on with the early peoples of Utah. And if you look at where they lived, this is out by Danger Cave towards Wendover, Utah. you see that there used to be a lot of water there. That's because as that giant lake receded, Lake Bonneville, and formed this little puddle at the bottom of the bathtub, Great Salt Lake, the aquifers were just bursting with water. There would have been streams and rivers and good fishing everywhere. So everywhere these caves are, you can see evidence that there used to be a lot of water there. So Great Salt Lake was a little bit of a different system there from a groundwater perspective. So there's even inhabitation later, and you see these horses, and probably this was a later time that folks were drawing on the cave walls out there. And then what happened? Well, then westward expansion happened. So a lot of white folks were coming into Utah, interfacing sometimes violently with the people who lived here. But the important point here is they brought a lot of people. There were a lot more people doing things and practices on the land that really had not been, that the Western landscapes had not been tested for. They were starting to divert water. They were starting to overgraze Western lands, et cetera. So it increased the demands on water. And we all know that there also was a bit of a respect for the lake. People really did sort of start to love this place. But then this terminal lake, it recedes, and humans had this really love-hate relationship with the lake. Some of the early journals from these white folks who came in talk about this relationship, this love-hate relationship with Great Salt Lake that I find fascinating. So then what happens is as they start to live around the lake, folks start changing it. And this map is kind of interesting because it shows all the ways that we've intervened with the natural system. So the black lines are causeways. We've got a railroad causeway across the middle. That was first built in the 20s, but it was shored up with rocks and closed off in like around 1960. That the other little causeway goes out to Antelope Island, that black line. The yellow lines are the yellow areas are impounded wetlands. So these were for duck hunters, the people who wanted to bring the waterfowl in. And that all started with the Conservation Corps in the 30s. So then the pink areas are all mineral extraction ponds. So those are areas where we are getting salt and magnesium and potash from the lake. There are also some lithium operations that are still in development. So mineral extraction is a big economy on the lake. So you see that we've messed with the natural system a bit, right? And so humans have intervened. This north part, as a result, is lacking input of fresh water. It doesn't get the snow runoff from these beautiful Wasatch Mountains. It's isolated from that input. And so it's gotten saltier and saltier and saltier, so that it's 10 times saltier than the ocean right now. So that makes it difficult for anything to live there other than my microbes that I study that are pink in color. So anyone in the audience ever been to Spiral Jetty? You ever seen this pink water up there? Yeah. So it really is a microbial soup. That's not where the brine flies and the brine shrimp are feeding all these birds. That part is South Arm. So this south part of the lake is really where the focus is on the vibrant ecosystem. That's what we're trying to save today. The North Arm we've almost sacrificed, except for mineral extraction. So the Stegner Center had me write a little booklet on the food chains of the lake. So you will actually see that out on the table as well. This is from that book. And you can see that there are two basic simple food chains in the south arm of the lake, one that centers on the shrimp and one that centers on the flies. The flies you might think of as creatures that do not live in water, but actually they live in the water about 9 months as larvae and little cocoons on the bottom, and they only live as a fly for 3 days. So we're going to count them as aquatic life. 10 million birds depend on that south arm of Great Salt Lake and the wetlands around it. 10 million birds. It's the most important body of water on the Pacific Flyway. This is where they get fat. But that causeway, we've started messing with it, because when we hit this crisis in 22, we hit a low, an elevation low for the lake, a historic low, and that meant that the lake got saltier than it ever has been as well. So we had this railroad causeway across the lake, and there's a breach with a hole in the causeway where boats could go underneath. And on the state committee I'm on the Salinity Advisory Committee, we voted to build a berm that you see in this picture just to the left of the railroad. And that would keep that pink North Arm water from coming into the South Arm and keep the South Arm from getting over salty from the intrusion of the pink water. And that may have been what saved the ecosystem before the snows came and did it for us. So humans are impacting this lake. We have partitioned it. We have diverted it for agriculture, for industry, for development. We are now seeing impacts of climate change, and humans are behind that too, right? So humans have impacted the system. It is a terminal lake. That means it's at the bottom of a basin. And so every piece of water you use upstream is water that doesn't make it to the bottom. So we only get the leftovers into Great Salt Lake. And that's why it matters so much, the consumptive uses upstream. Mega drought cycles, and you mentioned this, Seth. So there is a cycle every 1,200 years or so where we see mega droughts in the Southwest, and this comes from paleontological hydro studies of soil moisture and tree rings and those kinds of things. And one of my good friends has been author on many of these papers, and I've learned a lot from him. And so we are in a mega drought cycle right now. You might remember the last one from all the ancient Puebloan sites in southern Utah that were abandoned. When I first moved here, everyone said they were abandoned for nobody knows why. Well, now we know why, because it was a mega drought. And humans had to leave. So we're in a mega drought cycle, which is a natural cycle, but we're also experiencing climate change, and we're also using too much water. And all of this comes to a question of what can we do? And you can see that we can't do anything about mega drought cycles, right? But the other categories we can do something about. Those are the things we can control. So the lake that used to look like this with these beautiful mats on the bottom, this is my student Victoire Samarno. She's actually working in University of Mississippi on her PhD right now. This is what we saw the next year. So you see that's really different. And we're seeing this in the field, and it's frightening. It's frightening. So we got a couple of good snow years, right? And we're going to wish for another one. But we're not expecting change over time to really occur. The climate change projections, by the way, these climate change projections were published by our ultra left-wing liberal governor's office. So at least we're allowed to say climate change in the state of Utah, which I think is fantastic. This came from a publication from the strike team, this policy assessment that came out. And you can see that on the top panel, we're expecting temperatures to rise over time. Those are the predictions from climate change. The second panel, we're expecting a change in precipitation to occur from snow to rain. That's serious, because rain will run off and evaporate, but snow keeps melting slowly and it holds the water better. It restores the aquifers better, so that's significant. And then the last one is evaporation rate. So we're not expecting water availability to improve on its own. So it's fine to wish that Mother Nature brings us more snow, but that's not going to fix it by itself. So I'm really happy to say that one of the important House bills that passed established a Great Salt Lake Commissioner, and I won't spend a lot of time on the strategic plan except to point to an important part in that it established a healthy lake level. So again, this is supported right out of the governor's office. So we now have a healthy lake level, an elevation that we can target, that green level right there. I'm going to put a little dot on the graph, which is where we are today at an elevation of 4192. So you can see that in a terminal lake, the waters go up and down. In 1986, we had an enormous amount of water come into the lake. That's an abnormal flooding situation. So that's not the sort of average for the lake, right? But you can see that high point. The normal up and down is normal for a terminal lake. We lose 3 feet every summer just in evaporation, right? So that vacillation's normal, but you can see that trend straight down since the 80s, right? So where we are right now is where we were in 21, which was not good. We're still not in the green area. So while we're celebrating more water in the lake, we're not solving the problem yet. So I'll just leave this with the solutions that I was challenged to come up with and tell you that some of these are in progress. Some of the laws that we've passed in the state of Utah circumvent these antiquated water laws, like use it or lose it. We are trying to get more people appointed from indigenous communities on these committees. That is slow, but we'd really like to see that happen. Addressing consumptive uses, the state is working with farmers on different crops, on managing less cuttings for alfalfa, for example, those kinds of things. Building bridges with other states. The Bear River brings the most water into Great Salt Lake. That's the agriculture corridor. That's why that's such a target. But 30% of the water that comes to Great Salt Lake from Bear River comes from Wyoming. So if we're not talking to Wyoming, then that's a problem. We need to establish, I said this in my chapter, the healthy range, and then we did that, right? So now we're working on a healthy salinity range on these state committees in concert with the Great Salt Lake Commissioner. And just considering the pluses and minuses of intervention. You know, I hated that railroad causeway for a long time because I thought it made our lake unnatural. And then lo and behold, ironically, it was the thing that helped us save the lake. So I think we need to think about the pluses and minuses of all the interventions, because we don't want to go to this. This is what the North Arm is. We did this experiment in 1960, and we know that we basically killed the lake ecosystem. We don't want the whole lake to look like this. Okay, thank you very much. So I will bring Bob up.
Greetings, thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bonnie, Seth, and Evelyn, Bob Kiter, and University of Utah Press that published this work. This is an exciting day for us. We gave a talk a couple days ago at University of Wyoming, but this is really the official opening and debut to the book. Evelyn mentioned that while this volume identifies a whole range of problems, we really have been trying to focus on solutions. From my perspective, this came out of my work on climate change. My PhD is in philosophy, but I also have a master's in paleoclimatology, and I've worked with climate scientists over the last 25 years. And it was my work with climate scientists that led to this talk and the perspectives that I will pitch to you today, which is to say, the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program began in 1990. And since then, we've spent tens of billions of dollars on climate science. Tens of billions of dollars. And the question is, what practical effect has all that money had? Well, we know so much more about the climate system than we used to. We also know, we have uncovered many more uncertainties that we had no idea about. But if you look on the ground, if you look at this local, regional, national, international level, things like Kyoto have largely been a failure. And so what has been the source and focus on my research for some 20 years now is, how do academics make a difference in the world? How can we improve the mechanisms by which academic knowledge of whatever type makes it out into the world? And the pitch I'm going to make to you today, that the missing element in our thinking about this is art and philosophy in the humanities. Not to denigrate the role of science at all. Science is absolutely necessary, but what moves people to action is not science typically. It's the humanities and particularly art. So that's the thesis of the next few minutes. First, our view of the American West. We defined it for the purposes of this book from the 100th meridian, the dry line where you have to irrigate in order to grow things out in Kansas, Nebraska, and whatnot, to the crest of the Sierras and the Cascades. That is to say, we did not focus on the mega cities of the West Coast. And we ran all the way to and over the two boundaries. We have a chapter up on the glacier area, and also down in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez watershed. Of course, the West is, if it's typified by one thing, it's this is an arid environment facing any number of challenges. But we also emphasized that the West is unified by a core set of myths. So let's think a moment about myths. Myths are lies, right? No, myths are organizing principles. They're narratives that structure our lives. Think how they work. Personal contacts are limited to 100 or 150 people. How many friends, how many acquaintances can you hold in your mind? Solidarity among larger groups than this, let's say the members of a town or a nation, depend upon symbolic connections. These symbolic connections are not primarily intellectual constructions, but rather they are stories and symbols loosely connected to history. They almost always pick something out of history that's real and then weave a larger narrative from there. They offer a sense of belonging. They help outline the different social roles that we can choose in our lives, and they identify heroic and non-heroic behavior. Now, they also are tied in with symbols, the red caps of St. Louis baseball Cardinals, or for that matter, of MAGA. And the main thing they do is that they're not a falsification of reality, but they are an idealization of reality. They are our attempt to improve upon reality and to imagine a better vision of ourselves. Which is to say that all of this, the function of myths, highlights the importance of aesthetics in our lives. Now, if we turn to the American West, consider, and this stuff's going to be familiar to all of us, consider the function of the Western. Hollywood's favorite genre in the 1920s, 50% of all the movies that came out of Hollywood were Westerns. And you can see across here from 1903 to 39 to 69 to 1992 to 2012, this is still a continuing motif. We never seem to get tired of the stories and the images of ourselves that the Western offers. Also in contemporary culture, if you think about science policy, the most famous document post-World War II, Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier, again picks up on this Western motif, and arguably the most successful new story line of the last 50 years, the Star Trek stories, right? Genres, the films, the series, right? Begin, as we all know, with space, the final frontier, which is an endless frontier of both space and resources. And so this is the theme of the book, where we want to highlight the fact that the frontier myths, assumptions of infinite space and resources, and the kind of cowboy figure of the self-reliant, individualistic, libertarian attitude where we can do as we damn well please, right? This attitude becomes dysfunctional in an age of limits. Now, if this is not the limit at Yellowstone, it's getting pretty close to it. And so the question for all of us who love the West is, how did we change the attitudes and expectations? Yes, science will remain necessary, but it is not sufficient. And I want to highlight here how art has prompted policy. This is Thomas Moran's painting of the Grand Canyon Yellowstone, 1872, which led directly to the founding of the world's first national park. A more local example for those of us who live in Jackson, Wyoming, is the work of Stephen Leake in 1910. Leake, living a little north of the hamlet of Jackson, was witnessing the starving of massive number of elk. He took pictures of this. He wrote articles about this that were published in women's magazines in the East Coast, which caused a tremendous outcry and led to the creation of the National Elk Refuge in 1912. So I would like to suggest that why we need to think about new myths or new imaginaries, it's time to really think about new ones, that this kind of militarized cowboy story that we have seen in the last couple, 3 decades really doesn't fit the needs that we're facing today. And so the question is, how can we adjust? And what comes next? Now, right now, we are still in a transitional period. Cam Scholey, who is the superintendent today of Yellowstone National Park, said to the Montana governor recently, "We will put no cap on visitation to Yellowstone National Park." But in a sense, they are through what we can call soft limits. If you limit the number of cars, parking spaces in a parking lot, you are putting a soft limit here. Similarly, with timed entries, such as we have in Zion and at Rocky Mountain National Park, and also in terms of how they design the roads and the parking areas and the trailheads. These are all ways that already the Park Service and the Forest Service are addressing the needs of the reality of limits. Now, there's also another way to deal with these issues, which is the spillover into adjacent areas, and to emphasize trails that don't get so much use. Or take Jackson, for instance, where you have the Palisades Wilderness areas just south of Jackson. And I've seen over the last 10 years a great increase as people have given up in trying to get into Tetons and go hike some of the trails in the Snake River Canyon. That's another management technique we can use. The Park Service is also very concerned about reaction. We saw an incident last year in Yellowstone, this past summer in Yellowstone, where a man died. The Park Service is concerned that people come to the park with this cowboy image that now I can be wild and I can do whatever I damn well please, and that this, in an age of increasing limits, sets up the potential for conflict. So finally, in terms of bringing art into policymaking, I'd like to make a couple suggestions. First, this is an inter and transdisciplinary approach. This is not art versus science. This is art and science. And by transdisciplinarity, I mean a kind of focus out into the world of the needs of people out in the world rather than just an academic focus. I want to emphasize the two roles of art, that it both communicates ideas, but it also creates new visions and new possibilities. Today, it can often present as advertising. And finally, while the National Park Service says concerning Yellowstone, some 85% of the people have a good or excellent experience in the park, I'd like to cite an old humanities book, Frederick Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man. It's just as we can educate our tastes for food or wine or art. We can also educate the public in terms of how to have a more aesthetic, but also a lighter footprint upon the places they visit in the American West. So with that, I'll conclude, and we look forward to any questions or comments that you may have.
So I return to the stage. We've got about 10 minutes or so available for questions, and we do have some on the Slido, and I invite others. We'll try to get through them. Let me start, though, first with a question to each of our panelists. The book, it seems to me, has, and Bob, you sort of alluded to this with your presentation, it sort of responds to the idea that we're entering into a new West as opposed to an old West. New West that reflects changes in cultural values, political values, recognition of science as an important dimension of this. But yet, the politics, at least in this internal part of the West, don't seem to change very much. Are we indeed seeing a transformation? And what are the characteristics of it, or why aren't we seeing a transformation?
Well, is this on? Yes. I'll take a first shot at this, and I'll note what's on the wall here in the law school. The arc of the moral universe is long. Sometimes it seems very, very long. Some of us are discouraged by what's happening nationally at the federal level. There are plans, for instance, to once again shrink Bears Ear National Monument by 90%. But I think that over the long term, we're going to see swings back and forth in this. But just as Bonnie noted that the governor's office now notes the realities on the ground in terms of climate change in the Great Salt Lake, I have enough faith in the ultimate wisdom of people that we're going to see reality and adjust to it over time. We just need to provide the tools to help people when they start to realize what's going on.
I agree with you, Bob. I was just in Turkey at an international saline lakes conference, and I led a workshop on declining lakes around the world, declining salt lakes, and I was, nobody's saved one of these yet, right? It hasn't been done, and so that keeps echoing in my mind that this is something that we could be known for. And I think that it was impressive what we could say that we had been a part of here in Utah. And that's not what the rest of America thinks Utah is. People in Utah like to be outside. We have a lot of public land. We respect the environment in ways that maybe other folks don't. And I think that kind of goes across partisan lines. And even if you don't have that reason to care in your heart, there are so many economic reasons to care. From dust storms and real estate to the brine shrimp industry to the mineral extraction industry. That lake is important for a lot of reasons, and it has lobbyists for those groups and for tourism. So even for the people who don't care, or the legislators who don't take it up, in my worldview, it's been really interesting to be at the same table with the industry folks. And that's where solutions come from, I think, is when you can forget about politics and you can work towards solutions, incorporating many different angles, including artist and humanist as well. So I'm really excited about what we've been doing in Utah, and that doesn't mean that I don't get discouraged often with things that don't happen as fast as I want, but I think we've got to open our hearts to those solutions and working with people.
I think what Bonnie said is really right on point with tackling some of these large environmental problems in the West. But I will take Bonnie's example and then apply it to a federal land management example. And right now, I would say we're not seeing that level of collaboration on an issue like federal land management. One of the problems is there's very opposing positions. Take here in the state of Utah, where there's, one position to try and take some of that federal land management back. Obviously, the status quo is to keep that federal land management. Well, I don't have an opinion on that. What I do have an opinion on is there needs to be a place in the middle where there can be more voices involved in that federal land management. And in some cases, some of the paradigms that we've held as truths in the West maybe need to change a little bit. While water is clearly one of the most important things in the West, the use of water by humans for consumptive uses can't be the thing that trumps all other issues all the time. So I think that sort of collaborative work that Bonnie's talking about, we are seeing, and I see in other places in my work, working with communities on climate adaptation issues, where we are seeing that level of collaboration, but there are still issues that are very siloed. And I would say federal land management is one of those issues that it remains pretty siloed and difficult even for people like myself who are doing research on federal lands, don't necessarily have much of a voice or seat at that table.
I would say there are a number of stories in the book that try to overcome polarization and to expand options beyond the ones that maybe we've had historically, that are trying to invent new ways of solving problems. So there's one example that I have in mind about ungulate migrations through Wyoming, where the two options have kind of been basically, you either develop it or you put a conservation easement on it that is in perpetuity. So it seems to be either all or nothing. And there's a story about, well, what kind of legal tools can we create that would produce options that are just enough to solve the problem? And one of those is a kind of seasonal protection, where there's compensation for ranchers who move livestock off the migration pathways just while the ungulates are using those migration paths. So that's the sort of example where you could see polarization, or you could see all or nothing solutions, but we can work towards alternatives.
Thank you for your responses to that. And Evelyn, picking up on your point, you suggested one solution that comes out of the book. One of the top questions that we have is, are there particularly novel solutions that have attracted either of the other three of you, your attention from the book that would help us address this age of limits? Seth, Bonnie, Robert?
Well, if I could mention something that's just in the offing, I'm in communication with someone at the University of Oxford in England who has a sizable grant, £180 million, to develop new approaches in the humanities. And in my conversations with Christine Girard, we're exploring the possibility that the humanities should turn toward a greater policy focus. Folks who are trained in the humanities, whether it's the undergraduate or the graduate level, aren't typically trained to see the policy relevance of the tools and perspectives and skills that they learn. And so this is something that I have some hope for the future, that the humanities could take on a greater role in helping us imagine different futures that are palatable to people.
I love what Bob said about art and science. I had a grant with an art professor for 3 years from the Keck Foundation, where we did art and science projects with students on the lake. And I do think that that art and humanities are a way to reach folks in really different ways than data, and I think there's a lot of similarity in the approaches of creativity in both the arts and the sciences. But I think when we had a student looking at the exposed tar seeps at Great Salt Lake and animals getting entrapped, particularly pelicans getting entrapped, they were looking at the data, but when these dancers went with the scientist and they choreographed a dance showing the pelicans getting entrapped, that really viscerally reached people. So I think there's ways to get messages across in multiple streams.
Did you want to respond?
I guess I would just restate some of what I've said about collaboration. I think some of these problems that we face, and specifically thinking about the work I do in the Lake Powell region, needs new collaborations because some of the structures of old collaborations don't work. For example, trying to find funding for doing work on federal lands that maybe should be done by federal agencies is one of those areas where I'm having to forge new collaborations to try and find ways to work within and negotiate between different federal bureaucracies. So I think really thinking about new ways to collaborate and new organizations and types of ways to both be funded and to collaborate on these problems.
Okay. Bonnie, a question for you. What does Mormon Church, as a major landowner and stakeholder and influential player in the area, the watershed of the Great Salt Lake, plan to do about the lake, and what do you think would be an appropriate or effective role for the church to play?
I think you will remember when we focused the Stegner symposium 1.5 years ago on Great Salt Lake that the LDS Church made a gift that day. They made an announcement of water rights from some stranded asset, I guess, of theirs, that they would let those acre feet of water belong to the lake. And I think that there is also a trust that came from the infrastructure package a couple years ago. Utah voted to put that $40 million into a trust that, again, shockingly, this wouldn't happen in Texas. Utah voted to make the trustees of that trust Nature Conservancy and National Audubon. And they're working with, buying other lands, water rights, in order to get more water to the lake. So I think the LDS donation was certainly a really important step in the right direction of leadership. And I think another thing that I've heard about from their sustainability folks is the landscaping at ward houses are notoriously very green, and starting to change that to xeric landscaping, again, to be a leader and people follow by example. So those are a couple of examples of leadership. The number of acre feet of water from those donations probably won't make a big a splash, if you will, in its own, but I'm hoping that the leadership will have followers.
So we're seeing some ideas of novel solutions emerging with respect to the Great Salt Lake. You're seeing natural regeneration in Glen Canyon area. Seth, is there? I think you addressed this, but is there a problem with invasives there? And if so, is there a way to deal with that going forward?
I don't know if I'd say so. Invasive species, non-native species are present throughout these restoring landscapes. Some of these non-native species are sort of weeded out by natural ecological succession. In fact, sometimes some of these non-native species facilitate the transition to native species. That said, there are certain species that some active management, I think, would be really called for in this case. Tamarisk. Fortunately, we're not seeing a lot. I'm not seeing much tamarisk reestablishing in any of these tributaries, which is really a kind of a remarkable thing considering how prevalent tamarisk has been. However, Russian olive is a non-native tree that completely overran the Escalante River drainage, and there was a multi-decade effort to manually remove all these Russian olives. So now in Glen Canyon, I'm seeing some Russian olives. Right now, the number of them is low enough that active management could really eliminate all of the Russian olive. Also, Ravenna grass is another species that's a non-native that actually escaped from national park ornamental plantings in Page and around Glen Canyon Dam. That's another species that some active management now, because the numbers are relatively low, could be very effective in preventing the spread of these particular species. So that's kind of where non-natives are at in the region.
Okay, thank you. That was one of the questions. We've got just about another minute or two. Let me turn to the two editors of the book to wrap up, Evelyn and Bob. We've had a question near the top of the queue here regarding potential impact of the changing administration, the arrival of the Trump administration, on this watershed moment. What effect might it have? What are potential responses to that emerge from the book? If you want to take a crack at that.
Evelyn. Oh, mine just died. Can I borrow yours? Is this on? Yes. Evelyn just shook her head and said, "Oh, I don't want to touch that one." Let me reframe the question a little bit in terms of what our hopes are for the volume. We hope that this volume is not the end, with the publishing of it, but rather the beginning. We're hoping through events such as this, the one we had in Wyoming and Laramie on Monday, and the one we have at Westminster College tomorrow, Westminster University tomorrow evening, others at bookstores across the West and in Arizona State and Boise State. We're hoping to prompt a conversation, and we're actually looking for ways to institutionalize this conversation. How? Well, we're kicking around things like conferences and workshops. We've even discussed the creation of some kind of center which would continue this focus upon places and problems and solutions. Now, you need funding for all this kind of stuff. We've got a little bit of funding. We're seeking more. But we are hoping that this is the beginning of a common set of conversations across the communities in the American West.
Did you want to add something, Evelyn?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add that we're in it for more than 4 years. As the problems in the West are constantly changing. And I think what we're hoping to provide with the book and what the authors are hoping to provide are some kinds of perspectives that take the knowing that policy solutions they have to keep changing as the situation on the ground changes. So when you're working towards policy solutions, you don't think, oh, we're going to, introduce zoning in some area and then we will never have to deal with this problem in this place again. It's just not like that. It is always about identifying change and then responding to change in ways that create solutions that have some kind of lasting impact and that make life better for the people living in that area.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us that change is certainly a part of our life here in the West and elsewhere within the country and beyond the country. Let me recommend again a Watershed Moment, The American West in the Age of Limits. Just briefly, the book has 23 separate chapters divided into several different sections: resource use and overuse, equitable communities, Preserving Private and Public Lands, Coexisting with Wildlife and Wildfire, and Restoring Nature. I think we've gotten a sense of the book and some of the subjects covered in the book. The University of Utah Press has available copies of the book for sale in the lobby. Our guests would be happy to sign the book. Let me conclude by thanking again the Cultural Vision Fund for its support of the Stegner Center, its events, including this green bag presentation. Let me also note that the 30th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium will occur in mid-March this year on energy. And finally, please join me in thanking once again our four speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today.